Hello, and welcome to another review video. This time around, I'll be taking a quick look at the returning collab Gintama. This collab will be treated similarly to Hunter x Hunter, where the previously introduced units will be retired from the RAM and replaced with a brand new RAM filled with new units. You'll still have a chance to get the older units if you do multi-pulls in the new Gintama RAM. However, this new machine will cost 10 magic stones per pull, as opposed to the OG machine that was 5 magic stones per pull way back in the day. If you'll be doing any rolling, definitely go with the multi option, as some of the OG Gintama units can be of some use. The most notable is Tokugawa, whose Evo is the only other unit that has a 2x XP leader skill. Other older units have somewhat interesting active skills or equips, like Kamui. Sure, these units aren't broken, but people without deep monster boxes might welcome some of these equips, though the awakenings and active skill cooldowns on the OG units still feel outdated even after the recent buffs. So only the units from the new RAM will be able to easily tackle modern content. The highlights for this machine are Utsuro and Gintoki. The former is a dark PvP leader that rivals Reinhardt as one of the best leaders currently in the game, and the latter is a capable swipe leader that can even tackle some endgame content. Utsuro is the BGM unit, so he will be hard to get without buying his bundle, but at least while chasing him, you could amass enough fodder to trade for a Gintoki or two, as that is the collab patch unit. Before going into more detail, I'll first go over some of the other non-RAM units from this collab. Also, please remember to like and subscribe if you find the video helpful. These 4 are previously released units. They can be obtained via Rainbow Token Exchange. I doubt that this will be all that useful, but you know the drill. Free is free, so you might as well get them. If you can't farm that many tokens, I would definitely prioritize this new equip that requires 20 Rainbow tokens. These 2 units are free if you complete certain quests. However, I do think that they don't have a lot of use, especially because these aren't even needed to fulfill Sync Awakening requirements. But again, free is free. This Utsuro from his own Descended Dungeon, on the other hand, is actually needed for the RAM version Sync Awakening, so definitely get him and max scale him if you'll be playing with that BGM unit. Hasegawa is a rare invade in the Kabuki district floor of the Gintama dungeons. There's nothing you can do to guarantee him to spawn, so if you want to get a copy of him, try to get an early start as his invade rate is somewhat low. The base and his equip might come handy for some budget Evo Gintoki builds, or maybe even for some Kafka builds, as the +3 combo buff will help overcome combo-related shields or fully activate leader skills like Kafka's. And while farming Kabuki District and the other Gintama dungeons, try to bring some of these units along in your team if you want to 891 them, by clearing the dungeons, and provided that the units are plus limit broken and are not in the helper slot, you'll be getting 30 plus points at the end of the dungeon. Sadaharu is the MP unit of the event, but since the Gintama badge is not in great demand, I would only get this unit if you see yourself using the base or his equip. The base is a low cooldown, damage-centric cleric with decent enough utility that can help you tank large hits. However, the usual utility you come to expect from a cleric comes in the shape of a Hilo E or L Awakenings, so a lot of teams might not be able to actually run this cleric. Sadaharu might also not be able to deal that much damage if you don't choose the 10C plus Super Awakening, though of course that only matters if you have a way to consistently cap break this unit. The Fortune cooldown comes at a price. Every time you use Sadaharu, he will bind himself for 2 turns, and if you don't clear that debuff ASAP, he won't be able to deal any damage. Other than using some other cleric active skill to fix the issue, you could clear the bind by matching hard Ls or via Divine Recovery Awakening. However, Sadaharu won't deal any damage on the turn that you clear the binds unless you also set up a light Skyfall combo. Honestly, trying to make this unit work doesn't seem worth the trouble. Generally, you'll be better off using other clerics. Sadaharu's equip doesn't really bring much value to the table either. The Hilo E Plus and Dark Crisis Awakening seems like an interesting combination, but I doubt there's that many places where you can effectively use this. At most, I would only get 1 copy of Sadaharu, maybe in case either form is ever useful. If you're low on MP, I feel like this is a safe skip. Like always, before pulling the trigger on any MP unit, check some of the other MP units that will hopefully be coming to an A very soon. Maybe some of these will serve your teams better. Alright, now onto some of the RAM units. Shinpachi, Tatsuma, and Mutsu are all water and wood units, but they don't really bring that much to those type of teams. The best water and wood teams are centered around Rem and Ram and Sambo, but since those are somewhat inflexible teams, it'll be pretty hard to fit in these Gintama units. As an example, Paris condenses the cleric and bulk buffing effects into one team slot, whereas you would have to run both Shinpachi and Tatsuma to bring similar effects to a team. Sure, maybe you want to keep those effects separate and you might need a bigger bulk buffing effect or really want to fit in a shield break, but I just feel like Ferris brings so much to the table as he is also a very good recovery stick that can also help you recover assist. Mutsu could help with the latter since he does have L awakenings, but Water Toka and Oro serve as better piercers for those water and wood teams since they also want the board changing effects of those non-Gintama units. None of these Gintama equips look all that impressive due to their active skills or lack of bulk, so I would generally consider these three as pure exchange fodder. I feel like the same can be said for Hasegawa, Ayame, and Hijikata, but these three do have a little bit more synergy as a wood and dark PvP team. Hijikata scales damage, combos, and Fua for each PvP that you match, but to deal meaningful damage, you will need to match at least 2 PvPs, which won't be that easy in a normal 6x5 board, not only due to the limited space, but because your Orb-Gen units might not guarantee enough orbs to make those 2 PvP matches. This team reminds me of the light and dark PvP team from Haikyuu, where you use 4 units with 4 turn cooldown orb-changing active skills that also bring other important effects to the table. 2 Hijikatas will make up a cap break system and void attribute absorption. Ayame will serve as the looping shield, and Hasegawa will give you an HP buff to help tank large hits. However, the last unit will be tricky to time since you will most likely use him whenever he's up for Orb-Gen, and therefore your team will ideally want another unit with a big HP buff to pop whenever it's needed. The last unit in the team will need to counter damage absorption shields, and either this or the other HP buffer should also be able to clear Awoken Binds and unmatchable debuffs, as none of the Gintama units are able to do that. A pretty solid option for this PvP team is Kuchina from the ongoing Mystics event. She is the MP unit, so you don't even need to roll in Mystics to get her. This wood and dark PvP team is able to clear endgame dungeons like the recent Crimson Title Challenge, but it's not a fast team since again, you will need to match 2 PvPs to deal significant damage in super gravity content. I have a few videos linked in the description below showcasing the team and other notable ones that use Gintama units either as subs or as leaders. Check them out to see if any of them are attainable. This collab has a couple of water and light TPA units to work in their own teams or to synergize with Gintoki's base form. However, these two don't work all that well with that unit and instead seem like they could make up their own team or even support Rem from ReZero. Nobume can close the Orb-Gen loop with 2 Rems, or you could make a team that relies on 2 Nobumes for Orb-Gen. She has a damage scaling leader skill, but since she gives no bonus combos, doesn't give a significant recovery boost, and lacks a damage reduction leader skill, Nobume doesn't work all that well as a modern leader. Captain Katsura is a slightly better leader, though he might face some recovery issues in super altitude dungeons. He's a strong damage dealer that can deal with damage absorption shields, but one slight problem with him is the lack of skill boost awakenings. Rem is a transforming unit that doesn't bring skill boost to the table either, so if you plan to use those 2 units together, transforming turn 1 will require a lot of specific equips. Captain Katsura is exchangeable for 7 Gintama units, but water TPA teams didn't gain much traction after all of the support in JP. Thus, I don't think most people will benefit from making this trade, especially if you have other viable teams. Okita is a looping HP buffer and self-cap breaker that also has a scaling leader skill like Nobume, but thankfully, this unit does give some bonus combos. His pure damage reduction leader skill will also make super altitude dungeons a little bit more bearable, though in dungeons like El Cloud, you will still need to pair with someone with a significant leader skill recovery buff. Kondo does give you a slight boost, but since he's not a pure damage reduction leader, his own recovery boost is not that effective. If you'll be pairing these two together, you'll definitely want to run Kondo as your leader, otherwise, as a helper, you'll miss out on cap breaking a unit to 24 billion. Such a team will want to include 2 Kondos to make up the Orb-Gen system that if properly placed, and along with Okita, will all give a looping 24 billion cap break to 5 units. The team damage output is pretty high, but the Orb-Gen does feel a little bit disappointing since you'll only guarantee 3 TPA matches. Okita's leader skill damage multiplier and Fua damage from making those 3 matches might not cut it in newer dungeons with very punishing super gravity or against enemies with high super results. Whenever I see Kondo, I mainly just see him as a sub in Fern teams, and usually it's only 1 copy. This team is pretty strong and capable of tackling endgame content, and again, since only one Kondo is used, chasing a second one to close the orb gen loop might not be worth it at all. Both Okita's and Kondo's equips will allow a unit to run the unmatchable recovery latent due to their SDR awakenings that will let that unit resist up to 4 skill delays. Most people could benefit from having both units, but I feel like one of each will be more than enough, and even if you're unlucky and don't roll them, I wouldn't get too stressed about missing them. Like Katsura is an attribute absorption voider with decent uptime that works in a base Gintoki team. He is sometimes used as an asymmetrical pairing in punishing super altitude dungeons due to his later skill recovery buff, though you'll notice that his FUA damage isn't all that high. Together with base Gintoki, the total FUA damage might not be enough to bypass annoying super assault movesets. In Gale Cloud, the 7th floor can flood your board with thorns or sticky blinds if you don't have enough FUA, but Tei's Orb Destruction active skill is a way you can easily deal with annoying boards like those. Tei will also come in handy to dealing with full water, light, or heal boards since base Gintoki does not override orbs. Not to mention, she is also typically your out to damage boy shields. And since Tei goes all out on utility, you will be able to use a damage-centric cleric like Sadaharu. There's still the problem of who's going to actually cap break Sadaharu, as most of base Gintoki subs only cap break themselves. Most of the base Gintoki builds that I've seen often include one or both of these units, so I would consider these as staples and would keep them if you have any interest in leading with base Gintoki. Katsura is exchangeable for GFEs, so if you didn't roll him from the RAM, you can somewhat easily obtain him depending on how much fodder you have. On the flip side, if you don't care about leading with base Gintoki, Katsura isn't a trade that I would prioritize. Tama is a damage absorption voider that you could use in the base Gintoki team instead of Captain Katsura. However, since she doesn't cap break herself, she won't be able to take advantage of her own damage awakenings. You could run Tama alongside someone like Serie, but at that point, your team might be better off someone else that deals with at least another important mechanic like attribute absorptions or damage void shields. The Gintoki and Shinsuke duo make up a 2-unit system that can loop an HP buff, attribute absorption void, and pierce effects. You also get some orgen for water and dark TPA teams half the time, meaning that you can close the orgen loop with someone on a 2-turn cooldown like Nobume. The bad news, however, is that this duo only cap breaks themselves with their first stage active skill, and even though 35 turns sounds like a long time, cap breaks are very commonly overwritten in most dungeons, so I would definitely not count on having the full 35 turns of a 24 or 48 billion cap break, and would recommend trying to include another unit that can reapply cap break effect to this unit. Sensei from Frieren could work with this duo as she can close the orb gen loop and also cap break this unit. However, a 13 billion cap break feels pretty weak in today's meta. I think the base forms of these two units are largely unimpressive, but their equips on the other hand can be of great use for some teams. Tama's Crew's 99 turns of a +2 combo buff is pretty rare for the latest endgame dungeons where buff voids are not too common. Plus, unlike Skyfall or Capbreak buffs, combo buffs do not get overridden by enemies. Enemies can give you a -3 combo debuff for example, but this will not override the +2 combo buff from the equip, and you would only get a net -1 combo debuff. The Gintoki duo's equip is a little bit more niche, and maybe not as impressive since it only lasts for 10 turns. However, 10 turns could be more than enough for shorter dungeons like the new Descended dungeons that we now get every single month. Utsuro's Heart sees a lot of use in Evo Gintoki farming teams, though there are other alternatives out there like Chibi Odin's and Karen's equip that you could use instead of this duo. Those other two equips were pretty hard to obtain though, and at the very least, this Gintoki duo can be exchanged for 7 Gintama units. If you have those two other equips, I would argue that you could skip this exchange. Sure, those alternatives don't bring an auto heal effect to the table, but Evo Gintoki has a great pairing that already handles that. Kamui is the orb skin unit of the collab, so you could purchase him for $20. However, I don't think that he's all that great, as no team desperately wants him. That's not to say that he's weak, but other teams tend to have better outs to attribute absorption shields. And when it comes to Evo Gintoki teams, those can run the attribute absorption void latent and use up Kamui's team slot for someone else that can speed up your farming, such as Orlando, who can bring a 50% gravity to bypass super assaults. Kamui also has a conditional cap break active skill like the Gintoki duo, duo, but at least this one can be quickly reapplied. Since we have access to Serie and Echidna, you could use Kamui in light or dark teams where his damage will not get half when facing water enemies. More damage is nice, but at times, more will not make much of a difference if the rest of your team already hits like a truck. In in-game dungeons, some 2-hit KOs will probably still remain as 2-hit KOs with or without Kamui's conditional cap rate. Maybe instead of trying to fit in Kamui, your team will benefit more from other units that have looping effects. His equip also grants a nice boost of damage, but just like with the base, it might not benefit your team all that much outside of short dungeons. I would only try to get Kamui if you want to assemble some of the optimal GA4 farming builds. If you already farmed the dungeon, or if you have no interest at all, then Kamui is probably not worth the chase or the $20. Kagura in Miya Custom is an exchangeable unit that requires 7 Gintama units. She can be used alongside Evo Gintoki teams, but she is kinda replaceable by some of the long-lasting Capricorn equips out there like Chibi Odins and Karens. Though if you expect to encounter Capri debuffs, bringing this Kagura around might be necessary so that your team can deal damage again. Apart from equips, you could also somewhat easily replace this unit. Isao from Kaiju number 8 also has a looping attacker cap break buff, though it is a bit smaller. You could also use Hagenesuka from Demon Slayer, or another option can be Yuri, but to get the most value out of these two, you will have to properly place some units. These alternatives, however, will not deal any damage in Evo Gintoki teams. So even if you have these units and equips that can replace Kagura in Miya Custom, if you're getting Gintoki, I would still try to pick up at least one Kagura, as she is pretty hard to beat damage-wise. Dina is obviously a much better version of this Kagura since this Bat Cafe unit also loops an HP buff, and the cap break being condensed into one unit means that Evo Gintoki teams can have a lot more flexibility and an easier time tackling even the newest in-game dungeons. It's a mystery if NA will get access to Mei Dina. Currently in JP, Dina and Riku can only be obtained by making purchases at participating cafes in Japan. Gonho alluded that those two units will eventually join the Bat Cafe realms, but the details are not yet clear. Anyways, only time will tell. So again, I would look into this exchange if you're getting Gintoki, since Kagura in Miya Custom is the next best thing. This Kagura is more of a staple in Evo Gintoki teams, as those often need an auto healer. The main appeal of Kagura, apart from her damage and double shield break active skill, is her leader skill. When you pair this Kagura with Evo Gintoki, you will reach Sensi just by matching the two pre-made columns generated by Gintoki's active skill. Though one small issue is that both this Kagura and the Miya variant might struggle to triple cap in super gravity dungeons that do not boost moon units. And the biggest issue is unfortunately that this Kagura is a REM only unit. Sure, you could get two Evo Gintokis on your side and pair with the helper Kagura, but since farming teams are often very specific when it comes to equips and latents, you might struggle to find the right friend. If you're getting Gintoki, then this is a unit you definitely want to get a copy of, especially because sometimes you might want to lead with double Gintokis so that you can deal more Fuwa damage, and thus you would actually have to own Kagura to use her as a sub. Speaking of which, let's first take a look at the Evo Gintoki. This form, just like with both Kagura versions, can struggle with damage if you don't choose the right Super Awakening. That's probably only going to be an issue if you're trying to tackle the latest endgame with this team. You shouldn't really be looking at dungeons past GA4, at least until we have access to Mei Dina. The Evo Gintoki team is more so meant to be used farming somewhat easy content. The swipe team is obviously not as fast as Kikuru's, since you'll have to sit through the combo animations, but since Gonho keeps introducing combo point shields in every new dungeon, even monthly descendants, an Evo Gintoki team will have a much easier time overcoming them. Evo Gintoki has access to a plethora of equips that give bonus combos for multiple turns, like Tama's Screw. Though if you don't have that equip or other comparable ones, you might have Katuga, a former GFE unit that works really well with Evo Gintoki. That unit can even replace Kagura in Miya Custom. The cap break is for a lower amount, but condensing the plus combo effect and cap break might be worth the damage reduction. Sitting through these teams' combo animations will definitely be time consuming, but you don't have to watch your phone. You could mindlessly swipe and not have a care about any combo void shields, damage absorption shields, and damage void shields, since an Evo Gintoki system ignores those two last mechanics. Maybe at times, the combos from swiping may not be enough to overcome combo void shields, but if that ends up happening, you'll probably only have to match a few other combos using the orbs not on the edge columns. And maybe you were unable to get Kikuro since she was a REM only unit, or maybe you were not around while the Kaiju number 8 collab was ongoing. At the very least, Gintoki can basically be exchanged for 100 magic stones apiece since he is the Gintama batch unit. The base form can tackle in-game content, but his teams didn't catch much traction in JP. Unfortunately, a lot of his best subs don't have looping cap break effects, and thus his team's damage output feels lackluster at times. It also doesn't help that his subs' other effects do not loop. Base Gintoki does have a potential eye-popping cap break of 450 billion damage. Of course, facing wood enemies is not something you can guarantee. There are a couple of units that can turn enemy to wood attribute, but none of them synergize all that well with Gintoki. Maybe Gonho will introduce such a unit that fits better in a Gintoki team, but by then, this unit will probably feel even more lackluster. When it comes to other meta teams, you see them consistently deal around 300 billion damage, give or take. So by comparison, base Gintoki teams do feel a little bit lacking because again, some of his best subs have turns where they won't be dealing damage. The team that I'm showing on screen is one that you could build from this gem alone. However, there are better ones you could assemble with other non-Gintama units to have an easier and more consistent damage output in the latest in-game dungeons. Check the description if you want to see them in action. Most people will definitely be getting Gintoki for his Evo version, and not the base. As a consequence, I think that you will struggle to find helpers to run the base Gintoki. Therefore, you will probably need to own 2 copies, but honestly, getting 2 Gintokis is not the worst idea because you ideally also want to own 2 Evo Gintokis, even if you own a Kagura. When farming, nothing feels better than enabling rematches. These 2 units will grant a looping 40% shield and void both attribute and damage absorption shields. Both can deal decent damage, but you will have to have some other unit cap break Yamasaki. Dark doesn't really have a shortage of cap breakers, but you'll have to be careful about running a sub-wide or team-wide cap breaker that could override Kyubei's 24 billion cap break. You could run Hattori as your sub-cap breaker, but since he is on a 5-turn cooldown, Kyubei is bound to deal less damage on some turns, since she has a 4-turn cooldown. You also might not be able to properly loop Hattori if he is your only solution to large hits. All of these issues, and the fact that Gintama has other stronger dark PvP subs, means that you rarely see these units being used in Utsuro teams. However, even if you pull the better dark PvP subs, i.e. Oboro and Shinsuke, you might still want to keep these 3 around as they have great equips for dark teams. Yamasaki's is maybe not that impressive, but could be pretty handy if you want to resist tape and cloud even while your assists are gone. Kyubei's equip is a significantly better version of Arc's due to the haste active skill and extra skill boost, and Hattori's is the only other one with a BDP plus and Cross plus awakenings. Even if you have some comparable equips, like Sundorm's, these 3 Gintama equips, being either Banishing or Dark Attacker physical types, means that you'll be able to activate the Self-Reliance or Resonance Awakenings on the better Dark BDP units from this collab. Tsukuyo can make up a 3-unit origin system that can deal decent damage. Light and Dark L teams are not that popular, and this unit doesn't bring them to the forefront mainly due to this unit's leader skill that lacks FUA damage. With the L batch being a thing, centering a team around Tsukuyo is not impossible, but it probably won't cut it in the newest in-game dungeons. Like with Reinhardt teams, Utsuro teams can have some trouble breaking parts at the same time or before the main body is destroyed without any gravity active skills such as Tsukuyo's. Also, one of the slots in the typical Utsuro team would need to have a self-looping cap break if you want everyone to deal damage. So even though this collab's BGM has no need at all for Tsukuyo's Orb-gen, you might want to bring this unit along to boost your team's overall damage and ensure that you break parts. Tsukuyo can also serve as your assist recovery person, and if Utsuro doesn't eat up all of Tsukuyo's generated light orbs, you might be able to recover at least 8 turns of assist void debuffs in one single turn. Tsukuyo is a great one-off, and I don't really think that chasing a full system will be worth it. Definitely keep an eye out for her if you'll be going after an Utsuro team. Shinpachi is a very solid cleric for both BDP teams that this collab introduces. This unit can deal damage and bring decent healing to the table, though his 4 heal OEs might not cut it in punishing super altitude dungeons without more recovery support. In Utsuro teams, you don't care much about manually healing, but at the very least, Shinpachi's heal OEs can help counter negative orb debuffs. This unit also gives a board for wood and dark PvP teams on a 4-turn cooldown. Even though he seems to synergize with other units in a Hijikata team, relying on a cleric for Orb-gen is not always a good idea. As I mentioned, Hijikata's team would actually want a unit that gives a large HP buff. Instead of a bulk buffing effect, Shinpachi's active skill will give you a random gravity and orb enhancement. They could come in handy when it comes to boss floors, as those tend to be very tanky, or it can help ensure that you break parts before the main body. Keep in mind that this is a single target gravity, so you should target the tankiest enemies or parts before popping Shinpachi. This unit also gives you an auto heal effect, but this won't be all that helpful as your team will definitely need to survive without it. Arguably, the random gravity effect won't always be all that impactful, so most of the time, you might overlook this unit in favor of other bulk buffing clerics. That being said, this unit is exchangeable for 7 collab units and might not be a bad idea to pick him up if you're able to. The lack of a bulk buffing effect in the active skill might not matter if you have other units like Shinsuke in your team. This double absorption voider is a common sub in Utsuro teams, though his uptime might not be the best. Some builds will even run to Shinsuke. That way, you will also get more shield break effects. This unit is great to have for all of the recent endgame dungeons where scattered large hits are commonplace. And thankfully, you are able to obtain this unit via GFE exchange. However, the last 2 titles in JP, which will follow the next endgame title in NA, will for the most part require looping HP or damage reduction buffs, so a unit like Shinsuke might not see all that much use in a month or two in endgame Utsuro teams. Still, all the content in NA right now calls for a large, bulk buffing unit such as this one in your team. Oboro, on the other hand, has remained as a staple Utsuro sub in the JP server. This looping shield is able to cap break adjacent allies to 20 billion. This latter effect is sorely needed for the most common Utsuro subs like Shinsuke, Shinpachi, and sometimes Kuchina, who all have great offensive awakenings but no self-cap breaking effects. Oboro's only downside is the fact that his active skill is on a 6-turn cooldown. Getting hit with a buff void or a cap break debuff soon after using Oboro will severely lower your team's damage output. Thankfully, buff voids are not present in the last couple of endgame dungeons, and when it comes to cap break debuffs, those are also somewhat scattered and you could work around them. So to not be slowed down, you will definitely want to know when to optimally use Oboro. Though worst comes to worst, you will at least have the 40% looping shield still available to you, and the damage from your Utsuros and maybe your last sub may be enough to progress through the dungeon. As a self-reliance unit with an all stats plus awakening, Oboro can get extremely tanky with Paracademy Kronos' equip. Even though that equip doesn't significantly boost damage, Oboro doesn't have much trouble triple capping, especially because he also will give a self-attack boost. I mentioned this equip because the Gintama and Paracademy Rem are overlapping for a couple of days. Maybe you get lucky and roll your Oboro early. If you do, maybe it won't be the worst idea to try your luck in the Paracademy Rem for Kronos. Both units being Rem only definitely sucks, and with Gintama being a 10 Magic Stone Rem, getting both can get very expensive. That being said, since banishing equips keep being introduced, Oboro has a handful of other options like Paracademy Yura's or Yamasaki's equip. Utsuro is the BGM of the collab, and you can purchase him for $30. This dark PvP unit rivals Reinhardt as one of the strongest leaders in the game at the moment. His playstyle reminds me of Doma, where you use 2 copies to make up an origin system and then match a special shape for damage. However, thanks to the BDP badge that you obtain when rolling Bramble, Utsuro teams can hit 10C just from a BDP match alone. Minimizing orb movement for an auto healer team like this one will be important to help minimize storm damage. If you don't have the BDP badge, playing an Utsuro team will definitely not be as easy, and your clear times will suffer since you will have to do a few manual combos. The one thing Utsuro has over Reinhardt, apart from not caring about matching heal orbs, is the fact that you can stall by blowing 7 or more dark orbs. At times with Reinhardt, you might find yourself needing to stall for certain units to be up, like your cleric. But since you will most likely need to use Reinhardt's active skill to activate his leader's heal damage reduction, you will also be cap breaking him to 50 billion. Adding other units like Seri and Valentinatina with looping cap breaks and the need to heal, which will bring you to 10C, stalling basically becomes impossible. With Utsuro, if you ever need to stall, you just need to pop his active skill, make a blob, and then auto heal for 60% of your HP. The blob match is also fairly quick, since you won't have to deal with any combo animations. Utsuro teams teams can also deal more true damage with the newly introduced defense bypass latent that, as the name implies, lets you bypass enemy defense when matching a BDP. This latent only takes up 4 latent slots, so it's possible to resist up to a 4-turn skill delay on units such as this one that have an SDR awakening. Resisting up to 4 skill delays usually cuts it in most dungeons, but some dungeons like Crimson and the latest title in JP are throwing 5 turns of skill delay. So this new latent, only taking up 4 slots, feels really nice. If you have played auto-heal teams like Fritz, you might be afraid that Thorns and Poison Orbs will be a big issue with Utsuro. However, Utsuro's leader skill gives you more leeway since you don't even have to match a special match to activate your leader skill damage reduction. If you have too many thorns, just do the minimal movements to match a dark blob, and maybe along the way clear other thorns to make matching a BDP easier on the following turn. Also, fitting in a Poison Surge latent shouldn't be too difficult. And even though this is a bit hard to do in NA right now, without reducing your damage output, once Path Cafe returns, stacking 5 Afternoon Tea Awakenings can let you ignore Thorn and Poison damage. The latest title in JP basically requires that many Tea Awakenings in Utsuro teams, since Thorns and Poisons are extremely common there. Utsuro's equip is one of a handful with double Part Break Awakenings, so it can come in pretty handy when you want to ensure that parts drop, and with its BDP Awakenings, you can make any damage dealer without BDPs take the defense bypass latent. The long-lasting Cap Break and Auto Heal can also be useful for some farming builds like Evo Gintoki's, or in in-game content, since again, buff voids are not present in the latest in-game dungeons. And this equip being Dark, an attacker and devil type means it will be extremely useful to meet resonance requirements. Though as nice as this equip is, chasing an Utsuro can get very expensive. If you get 1 copy, that can be more than enough if you don't mind relying on a helper. I don't think missing out on the equip is the end of the world. But for your Utsuro team, you will definitely want to have at least 1 Oboro. This unit has remained a staple in Utsuro teams ever since this leader was introduced in JP 2 months ago. You could replace Oboro with 2 Nuraregions, though taking up 2 team slots won't leave you with much flexibility when it comes to your other 2 subs. The Nura version can tackle endgame, but I feel like the Oboro versions are a lot better. Other units in this realm of note for Utsuro teams are Shinsuke and Shinpachi, who unlike Oboro can both be exchanged. Those 2 aren't as hard to replace as Oboro, but I still recommend trying to get them to have more sub-diversity. Tsukuyo is not a staple in Utsuro teams, but she's nice to have if you ever need to break parts. It is a bit hard to stack Part Break Awakenings to ensure that parts drop in Utsuro teams, but remember that Part Break Awakenings will increase your bulk after breaking parts and thus make your Utsuro's auto heal way more impactful. The other dark units in this collab, like Kubei and Hattori, aren't that notable when it comes to their base forms, but their equips can be useful for activating resonance on Utsuro and Shinsuke. Or in the case of Yamasaki's equip, it can be used to activate Oboro's Self-Reliance Awakening. When it comes to the badge unit, I would try to get 2 copies so that you can farm with his Evo form. On the options that you want to play with the base, I feel like you would also want to get 2 copies so that you can self-pair because he won't be a popular leader and you will struggle to find helpers. Evo Gintoki definitely wants Kagura for his teams as she is the best auto healer that can also deal a good chunk of damage. Plus, most importantly, by pairing them together, you will be hitting 10C by just swiping. Kagura in Miya Custom and Kamui can also fit in an Evo Gintoki team, but these 2 are easier to replace than Kagura. I would still try to grab Kagura in Miya Custom if you have the means, since having more options is always better. Kamui is unfortunately REM only, but if you want to assemble some of the optimized teams to farm GA5, you might want to look into buying the bundle, as this is the Collab's Orb Skin unit. Again, check the playlist in the description below if you want to have a better idea about what those builds require. Both Katsuras, Tei, and maybe Tama can be used in some base Gintoki setups, so keep an eye out for them and maybe consider trading for either Katsuras if you don't happen to roll them. But like I mentioned in the Gintoki section, a team leading with the base form feels a bit lackluster, and maybe the Katsura trades won't be worth the fodder if you don't see yourself playing with that leader. The last tradable unit that I haven't mentioned is the Gintoki and Shinsuke duo. The base form is also pretty lackluster, but the equip can be pretty good for some farming setups due to the auto heal and sizable leader cap break effects. Even though his orb gen calls for 2 units to loop, Isao is a good one-off to get if you have a firm team. That team has decent enough orb gen already, and with with Isao looping cap break to his right-hand ally, you can now get every unit in the standard Fern team to deal a sizable amount of damage. It is very unfortunate that this 10 Magic Stone Rem has a lot of units that you do want to keep at least one copy of, either for the base or for their equips. One somewhat notable equip that I forgot to mention in his section is Hasegawa's. This one could be pretty good for a ranking dungeon, so I would recommend keeping every copy that you manage to roll. Hasegawa and a couple of other units make up a wood and dark PvP team that is capable to tackle some endgame content, but this one gains even less traction and requires more labor than the base Gintoki team, so I wouldn't really recommend chasing those Rem-only units. There's also the MP unit Sadaharu, but the only Gintama team that kinda uses the base and the Collab badge is the base Gintoki team. If you do plan to use it, make sure to grab Sadaharu, because most of the upcoming Rems don't look all that interesting to me. I think that spending most of your stones in the Gintama collab is not a bad idea. Best case scenario, you assemble a top tier meta team with Utsuro. If you fail, hopefully you can exchange your fodder for 2 Gintokis so that you can easily farm a lot of content. Maybe you'll also pick up some pretty good equips here and there. Obviously, Gintoki works best with units such as both Kagura's and Kamui, but it might be entirely possible to not roll these units. It is somewhat possible to replace them, but hopefully you do get them and won't have to think about that. If you're low on resources, definitely get all the free rolls you can if you want to play it safe. My main goal for this Rem is to get those 2 Gintokis. I'm not really going after the Utsuro team because I'm only planning to spend around 300 stones. I would much rather save up for the next jump in power creep as I do have a Reinhardt team and Utsuro isn't that significantly better. Out of the possible events that might come to NA, I only see myself spending a modest amount in Path Cafe because I really like some of the equips there. Madoka Magica Super Catfest just started in JP, but after seeing the full details, the Madoka units are not looking all that great. But do let me know your plans in the comments below. That's it for this video. Best of luck if you're rolling. Thank you guys for watching, and a special thank you goes out to Ages Number 1, Austin, and Okra Panda, Breastfeeding Obama, Daniel, Eddie Ryan, Professor, Slotham, Shady, and T Bunny Fish for supporting the channel. I really appreciate it. I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.